This is the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety's Disaster Discussions podcast, where we explore the intersection of weather and the built environment.
In late January 2026, a powerful winter storm blasted across the country, bringing historic snowfall to the Carolinas, ice to Mississippi, and dangerous cold into the southern U.S. On this On the Radar episode of Disaster Discussion, in late January 2026, a powerful winter storm blasted across the country, bringing historic snowfall to the Carolinas, ice to Mississippi, and dangerous cold into the southern U.S. On this On the Radar episode of Disaster Discussions, we're recapping this record-breaking storm and diving into the science communication challenges on messaging for winter weather in the Deep South. Plus, how all digital weather enterprises are changing the game for broadcasters who want to message high-impact events when they want and how they want. And we're talking infrastructure, building codes, plumbing design levels, and how these leave homes vulnerable to things like freezing pipes and ice dams, and how winter weather is a leading cause of interior water losses. Welcome to Disaster Discussions. I'm your host, Rachael Penton Gauthier. And we have some special guests on the podcast today. Joining us again is Dr. Ian Giammanco, IBHS Managing Director of Atmospheric Science, and Matt Laubhan, Emmy Award-winning Chief Meteorologist for Mississippi Live Weather. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah. Hey, Rachel. Good to be back.
Yeah, and Matt, you have never been on the podcast before. You actually know Ian and some of the other colleagues here at IBHS. So just tell me a little bit about yourself, your career path, and how you guys know each other as well.
So I grew up in the middle of nowhere, Kansas, and got my degree in atmospheric science from the University of Kansas. So I know Ian's wife through that route there. We went through our undergraduate degree. She went more professional meteorology research, and then I went the broadcast route here. So then after college, I went to West Texas. Of course, where Texas Tech is located in Lair and Lubbock. Spent 7 years there. That's where I met Ian. And then about 15 years ago, moved here to Mississippi in the Deep South to cover severe weather and tornadoes, and been here ever since.
Awesome. And you're a former local TV meteorologist. You've set out on your own now, and we're going to dive into a lot more of that later. Really interesting endeavor that you have going on. And that's something really exciting that we're going to talk about a little later. We actually have a range of subjects today, but I do want to start with this recent winter storm that affected the South. So we actually have two events to talk about, and we're going to get into some of the science communication aspects of both. I want to hear both of your opinions on this, but let's dial back a few weeks ago. We had a first system that was threatening the Carolinas, parts of the Southeast. This was the second to last week of January. So here in the Carolinas, we were facing the possibility of what could have possibly been a major ice storm that was on the table at the time. Forecast was calling to up to an inch of ice accretion here in the Charlotte area where I'm located. We were getting ready for the possibility of extended power outages in the Charlotte area and at the research center, the IBHS Research Center in Richburg. We knew sleet was on the table as a possibility. I think as meteorologists, we were all sort of wish casting for that sleet over ice. But of course, the job of a broadcast meteorologist is to prepare folks for the worst possible outcome. And Ian, I want to bring you in to talk about one of our local meteorologists, Brad Panovich, really well-known broadcast meteorologist here in the Charlotte area. And he addressed the storm actually after the fact. So it did pan out to be more of a sleet event. We did not get that worst case scenario, but a lot of people didn't seem to like that outcome. And Brad made a post on social media sort of addressing this really interesting science communication aspect, which is, he said, quote, "We live in really odd times as meteorologists. Our forecasts are getting objectively more accurate, yet the perception is that we blow it more often." So this was a topic of discussion, Ian. Talk about this kind of what he called it rooting for ruin phenomenon. It's weird that people seem to want the worst case scenario, and they want it to validate the warning. What are your thoughts on that?
So this is something we see pretty much all hazards. It doesn't matter what it is, whether it's a winter storm or a tornado where everyone is screaming about it should be an EF5 for some reason. I don't personally quite understand where folks are coming from. for those who've had their worst day, it really doesn't matter, right? Like this, what it is doesn't matter. You had your worst day. You may be dealing with extended time out of your house. In the worst case scenario, you might not have a house to come back to. But we're running into this. And we also know that people, especially in these winter weather events, and we see it with severe weather too, and Matt can really dive into this, is people will latch on to early forecasts and not look back. They just continue on with their routine and their life, and then realize when what was forecasted 5, 6, 7 days ago doesn't play out. And we know there's plenty of uncertainty in the weather. It just strikes this emotional chord, and people get really frustrated. We can contribute, we can add in things like the reliance on very basic weather apps that take explicit model guidance, and I think it's all a combo. So this is a real problem, and it is growing. And I personally have no idea what we're going to do about it. But it's something Brad had to deal with in real time. And I don't get the need for every day or every event to be the worst. And if it doesn't happen, to be angry that the worst did not play out. I really don't understand.
Yeah, it's a really strange phenomenon. I think broadcasters have really done a great job adapting, especially in recent years, where I see meteorologists actually explaining all the different possible model outcomes, even going so far as to explain what an ensemble is in their broadcast forecast, which was a thing you maybe wouldn't have done in the past. But I think broadcasters have done a really good job of explaining the range of possible outcomes. So Matt, you work in Mississippi. I used to work next door in Louisiana. I know as well as you do, the South gets a little bit of everything from the severe weather to the winter weather events like these, tropical systems. How do you deal with situations like this?
I am blessed that after 15 years here, that people trust that when we say it, it's probably going to happen. And that allows me to take a little bit more of a wait and see approach as opposed to in a more competitive weather market. You mentioned Charlotte. You mentioned Brad, very well known in that market. There are a lot of other meteorologists in that market, and they're all looking at the same data. And we all know 10 days out, okay, we could have ice, but that just as easily could be just rain or something else. When clicks are monetized, when shares are monetized, and reach actually generates dollars and cents in a TV world where salaries are stagnant, in some cases declining, a monetized Facebook page that gets 100, 200, 2,000 shares incentivizes riskier long-range forecasts. And I think that used to just come from the outliers. And I think, unfortunately, where we're going to see this is more and more, this is going to come from some of our mainstream meteorologists, because that's where followings are built. Well, this guy will tell me straight 10 days out. Well, is it actually straight? So that's really the question there. So I think for us, the way we've been fortunate enough to handle it here is we have had an established following that knows that we will tell them straight when we know, and we're not going to say anything really until then. But I think there are going to be these outside pressures, especially with the introduction of AI and the ability for you to drop a model forecast in there and tell it, I want something that's sassy and uses Gen Z, language, and that is shareable for non-weather related reasons, goes viral for non-weather related reasons, and makes that person way more money probably than I make a year just off of hyperbole. I don't think it's going away. It's going to accelerate where more and more even mainstream meteorologists are going to have to make the decision of how early you're going to make those calls.
Yeah, you brought up a really interesting point, the monetization aspect. And, some meteorologists like yourself, who's running your own operation, you have the ability to control when and how you want to message. But there's a lot of other factors at play. Those who work for media companies, often it could be an executive producer making this decision. It could be a news director. The meteorologists themselves, they don't always have the power to decide when they want to start communicating and how. Sometimes there's other driving factors behind that. They don't have total control in many cases. So I think that's another really, really interesting aspect. All right, so I want to move on to the second winter weather event. This one evolved immediately on the heels of this first system. We had a really powerful system set up and move across the country. Ian, just give us the general meteorological setup for the second big event, which is the one we're going to focus on today.
Yeah, we sort of flipped the script from a stagnant, like really long wave trough in the east, big ridge in the west. We got into this sort of progressive pattern for a little bit. And so we took a couple of systems right across the country, grabbing a whole bunch of Arctic air with it. And then you ended up with this swath of winter weather that really extended from like East Texas all the way through the mid-Atlantic and eventually spun up a coastal low off the New England coast. This can happen. These are our big winter storms. This is the type of setup that you're looking for. We get into the lingo. I think this one falls into the Miller B bucket for the Mid-Atlantic. But these are the things that bring us winter weather to the south. I grew up in South Louisiana. These things were rare, but this is the pattern you were looking for, are these big deep troughs that swing across the U.S. that can grab a whole bunch of Arctic air and drive it south. And they do happen. The sort of not quite from a total scope of the winter precipitation like the event several years ago, the Arctic air outbreak in Texas and Louisiana, but still similar. You had this swath of winter weather really extending a long distance. And in this case, it was really from East Texas all the way through the Mid-Atlantic into New England.
Yeah, and just kind of continuing on with that science communication trend, we know that, depending on where you are as a meteorologist in the country, that affects your messaging when it comes to systems like this, specifically winter storms that could affect the South. So, Matt, as you began to watch this system, how do Mississippians react when they start to hear about storms of this possible magnitude? And what are some of your messaging strategies as you start to see that, your area of the country could be impacted by winter weather like this?
I've always taken a very slow approach on winter weather. I will say, with the exception of this storm. I think very early on, I think models did an excellent job here, at least with the Mississippi portion of this. By Tuesday, we were already talking ice for an event that started, Friday evening. So we had very early clear messaging that the ice was on the table as a possibility, not just sleet, but freezing rain potential. And at least for where we were at, I felt like models did a very good job of depicting this. So this was a success in a lot of ways. And I feel like the entire weather enterprise was really aligned on how we handled this. Ensembles picked it up very, very well. And so this is all the technological advances really, I think, shined in this with our discussions with the Weather Service, with, some of the descriptive products like the WSSI, that Winter Storm Severity Index, that painted a bullseye stripe right over top of some of the locations that really got the worst. At least 36 hours out, we knew we were talking about significant accumulating ice fall, and we were relaying very specifically impacts. You're going to have power outages, potentially for days. By the last 24 hours, we were saying maybe even weeks. We were going to have, expect to be trapped wherever you're at for at least days, at least through the weekend. I think the messaging, whether it was private sector, podcast, or governmental, was very clear cut on this early on, but sometimes it's just that bad. And that's kind of where we landed on this one here.
Yeah, exactly. As you mentioned, that forecast was spot on here in the Charlotte area. We received a record amount of snow, 11 inches recorded on January 31st. That makes it among the top 5 snowiest days in Charlotte history. Another really interesting aspect, that unusually dry, high ratio snowfall, 22:5 liquid to snowfall ratio. Really dry, fluffy snow. Snow ratios like that I used to see in Alaska. That would not be expected in Charlotte. That was pretty interesting aspect, Ian.
Yeah, that was the owing to the cold air and with some depth to it. You got these really, really, dry, powdery. This is the stuff of the Intermountain West that skiers love, that showed up in Charlotte. I live here in the Mid-Atlantic in Maryland in the DC metro, and then we sort of waffle between that and the big slushy wet snow, which is more typical of what you get in the South, where your sort of depth of the column hovers, just below the freezing mark. And but again, there was a boatload of Arctic air with this particular system, and coming on the heels of the one before it, so you're just reinforcing all that cold air. And you ended up in the Charlotte metro with this just kind of beautiful, powdery, dry snow. And we all know, though, where the phase change line is where you're going to get the mixed bag. I'll think about living in the Charlotte Metro at IBHS for a while. Usually that boundary always set up across York County. For whatever reason, it's just where we would end up in that mixed bag of precip between snow, sleet, freezing rain. That transition zone just north of it is where you get the heaviest snow. And then where that band falls, and often just to the south, is that freezing rain scenario where the cold air just isn't deep enough. You get some warm air that overruns it, and you get really a very, very nasty setup. And in this case, it was such a strong system. You're going to produce really substantial, a lot of lift with it. So you're going to get the precip rates. And it's just figuring out, as Matt mentioned, in those last 36 hours, we're really honed in on where that precip phase change line was going to be. And sure enough, it played out.
It did. And we saw measurable snow reported in places like Wilmington, Myrtle Beach, Savannah, blizzard-like conditions out on the Outer Banks. Really, really interesting storm. And of course, northern Mississippi, one of the hardest hit areas of the country as far as the freezing rain goes, about an inch of ice accumulation in and around places like Oxford, Mississippi. So Matt, give me the rundown of the area that you cover. What were some of the impacts during the height of this storm that you were seeing?
One of the things that was just so unique about this system is the ice started falling in some freezing rain variety, sleet variety, Friday evening, and still Sunday at midday we had freezing rain and or sleet falling in some spots. So we had, well over 24 hours to 36 hours of ice fall. And that's just not something we typically see, in general, but certainly not here. And so we cover really the northern third of the state of Mississippi. So in our specific area, we had about 150,000 people at peak that ended up losing power. And this is not a metro area we're talking about here. We had some people that, as we're recording this, that the latter part of February, still without power, almost 4 weeks later. It's that last mile. So just a lot of rural communities and places where it took well over 10 days in some cases to get people into those most remote locations. So it was a lot of ice in an area with a lot of trees, but it's been hit in the past by significant ice storms. The one on record for this region would be 1994. Since the first day I got to Mississippi, every time we would say chance for ice, it'd say, is it going to be 94? And that had a crippling effect on the region where people were out of power 3 or 4 weeks. And I think people thought that would never happen again. Fortunately, it did. But where power systems and utilities were intentional on keeping right-of-ways clear, power came back on more quickly because there were less down power lines. But in general, even in those places where they did do effective job, it was still more than a week without power for a lot of folks.
Yeah, some of those images were just, riveting, catastrophic, with the amount of ice on the trees, the amount of tree branches and trees themselves just collapsing under the weight of that ice. Just some of the images that played out on social media, just really, really compelling. So certainly catastrophic level for any location, especially in a place like Mississippi that has seen this before, but it's not an every winter type of event. I want to talk more about the infrastructure in a little bit. We're gonna bring in some of our IBHS research here shortly, and we're gonna go more into some of those impacts that you saw in Mississippi. But I want to talk more about sort of you taking your messaging into your own hands with this digital weather world aspect. So as we've talked about today, you left the local TV news industry after many years working at a TV station. Talk about the decision to go out on your own, and how does that play into your ability to cover these big events the way that you want them to be covered? Tell me about that aspect.
I never really wanted to go out on my own, but I'm also in my mid-40s, and it was difficult for me to visualize television in its current form being something that was viable by the time I hit retirement. And so there were some changing dynamics in the industry. There were layoffs announced at at my TV station that would have affected me and every other broadcast meteorologist that they had around the country. They're going to centralize things from their hub in Atlanta. They eventually rolled back that decision, but I used to joke that outside of nudity and cursing, I'd keep my job probably until something very drastic happened, and I was reminded that maybe it was a little more flexible than I thought. So this is something I considered for a long time. So we started Mississippi Live Weather, and because the delivery mechanism in which people get most of their information is the thing that we're recording this on. I'm on a phone right now. We use tablets here. We don't look at TVs unless it's a big gathering event. And when we've been going to shelter for severe weather for years, we've been taking our phones with us, not TVs. So the delivery mechanism is already very well defined. And so putting broadcast on an app first, on social media first, has allowed us to deliver our information directly to the viewer where they're at. And in the case of this event, that proved important. Rather than having a broadcast facility like a TV station, we do have a main studio in downtown Tupelo here in Mississippi. But we also have a studio in Senatobia, where my morning meteorologist works from, in her house. I have one in my house. We set up one for my evening meteorologist in his house. And so on the day of the ice storm, we were telling people at home, do not travel. It's dangerous. All of these things. If we have all of our people driving on the roads, or we're out actually at a studio, then we're going to have to disobey the thing that we're doing. So I had everyone at home. We all broadcast from home. And as infrastructure collapsed, one person would go offline because they lost power and internet, and the next person would go offline. I'm lucky that I have the electric F-150, so I ran a cord into the house to make sure that we could power all of this, and that we had fiber internet, and we had a backup internet source as well. So we had some layers there to help out. But at one point, I was the only one still with the infrastructure to be able to broadcast. And at that same point in time, the television station couldn't broadcast that I was previously at. Their generator had an issue. There was some pump that failed, and so they had to get someone up there because the water had filled the basement. I mean, all kinds of stuff went wrong, and we were able to still continue to broadcast. And that's not an us versus them. That's a sign that resilience can look differently. If you can spread your resources out, you decrease the odds of being completely off the air.
Yeah, that's some really interesting points there. I've always thought it was strange that, we're standing out on the street corner, with a icy tree in the background telling people don't leave your house, when we ourselves are traveling during the most dangerous time, putting crews at risk, crews at danger. And then, your ability to actually be on when, even the TV station wasn't. That really changes the game. I mean, that ups the competition by a lot.
It really does, and the thing is, I don't think 10 years ago the technology was truly in place to be able to pull this off, but there's software where I can have a broadcast level 4K switcher to be able to put on. The other day during the ice storm, we had 4 live shots, essentially counting this live shot here in the individual studios. We had 4 different live locations on the screen at the same time covering this. And that's something that many legacy broadcast stations can't do. And I can send you a link, just like you do for a podcast here. I could send you a link, type in your name, and have you live on my system here within about a minute and a half. And so in the aftermath, and I know we'll touch more on that, but even during it, when we needed to talk to officials, as power outages were starting to pick up so that, we could relay that information, we could just send them a link, and 2 minutes later we could be live with it if we needed to. That is the instantaneous benefit that we have.
That's awesome. And it's great to see so many different, experienced, knowledgeable, credible broadcast meteorologists going out and starting these digital weather enterprises. There's so many of them. You guys are actually part of more of a national digital weather network, and a lot of them are former broadcasters that have joined in. Tell me a little bit about that.
This started with a couple folks up there in the Northeast, a guy by the name of Nor'easter Nick, and in Tennessee, a man by the name of Ben Luna. And they basically started these digital meteorology operations. Ben Luna, the one that I interface with more, but we're all kind of part of this kind of collective here. But starting in the back room of a radio station, he was the general manager of that. The community is like, hey, you have a weather background. We need weather information. They're halfway between Nashville and Huntsville, so in an area that is underserved community. And so they just started doing weather coverage. The community loved it, started selling advertising. They have at this point here, they have, I think, 18 employees, including sports and commercial production, stuff like that, and own their own building in Lawrenceburg, Tennessee, a city of 10,000 people. When I saw that and I went through my situation where, layoffs had happened and were taken back, I was like, they can pull that off there. I can pull this off here. And so you have a situation where there's going to be a contraction in the number of a consolidation, in the number of broadcast companies out there doing television news, where I mentioned Huntsville. If all the purchases go through that are presently out there in the space, you're going to go from 4 TV stations to 2 TV stations. And that is going to necessarily mean you have people that are laid off. So there's going to be people looking for something to do. And I think this is a very viable option. We've seen that around the country with people choosing to leave on their own. I think there's going to be some folks that are kind of forced into that. And I think that's going to allow us to do a better job serving the end user. If everyone's trying to bite off huge chunks of state, that might be more difficult. But, if somebody goes all in on Charlotte and just does Charlotte, guarantee you they can do it better than somebody who's doing the entire region, because they can be super sensitive to what's going on there. And I think that's going to start happening, where people start taking smaller chunks of the country, and I think it's going to be good for the end user.
Yeah, and there's a lot of those folks already doing that. I think it's really interesting, really great. I do think it's the future of the weather world. But I want to bring in a bit of a controversial point. So a trusted voice like you with many years of experience in one market is one thing, but we have a lot of, I guess for lack of a better word, amateur sort of YouTube meteorologists who maybe don't necessarily have the same formal education and background. Some of these digital weather guys have millions of YouTube subscribers. They have, tons of views. Ian, I know you have some thoughts on this. We do have to give them credit where credit is due in some ways. There's been a lot of discussion, what is it that they're doing right? How are they attracting millions of followers? We may judge them, and maybe they're not as qualified as folks like Matt, but are they doing something right? What's the dynamics on this?
So Matt sort of hit it. There's this want for much more hyper localized information. We as people want to know what is going to happen at my house at a given point in time. That serves 2 purposes. That can be good and bad. I think Matt touched on, this, if we can get into the streaming world in a local sense, you're probably going to do it really, really well. But on the same vein, you're going to create an appetite for people going to look for that information, and they don't know where to look. We talked about clickbait headlines, things like that. We've monetized social media. All of that gets thrown into this bucket and mixed up into what we see today. And most people don't know where to look. I have a lot of friends from back at Texas Tech who live in the Dallas-Fort Worth metro. And the amount of text messages I get when they're under a slight risk or a moderate risk, nobody knows how to make sense of anything. And I don't know really how to solve that, because we're just flooding with so much information and people are looking for it. So there's a positive to it, but there's also if you go to the wrong place, you're going to find some outlandish forecast that's really just driven to get engagement numbers, because we now function in this metric driven financial society. And it may not. And I'm going to latch on to it, right? They said there's going to be a tornado outbreak in 5 days. And then at the end, the dry line ends up 80 miles off to the west or east, and nothing happens, because especially in severe weather, right? You can go from having big hail or dealing with tornado warnings to just, for a lot of people, it's a sunny day. And so there's where the trust starts to fall apart. And it's not any one doing that's eroded it. It's sort of this combo of the system. So I don't know. I don't really know. I often tell people, if you want warning information, the Weather Service, find just one good. I use the WeatherBug app on my phone to do that. It works just fine. There's the EAS system. And then you're going to go find somebody like Matt or somebody else that can bring you that level-headed information. And that's the key. You got to pay attention. But at some point, there's so much of it out there I don't know how we can guide folks to filter it. And yeah, the financial incentives, I keep believing this market from a clickbait social media pure engagement monetization will saturate itself at some point, but I honestly don't know. I don't have a good answer, and it's very frustrating. And we've had this conversation at the recent AMS national meeting about the ethics involved with this. And flip it around, we know in the engineering world, you put your stamp on a drawing set and that bridge falls down, there is a huge liability that comes with that. I don't think we're in that space in the weather world. That's a sort of a different animal, but I'm just using the engineering field as a comparison. If you're a practicing engineer, you put that stamp on a drawing set, there is a responsibility that comes with that. Whether we head down that route as a weather community, I have no idea, but we are in a very, very different place than Matt. I think back when we first met in Lubbock, we are in a very different place today than we were 20 years ago, in a much more conventional world.
Let me put one of the interesting things you mentioned, putting your stamp on that, right? And so, like, one of the talks obviously is, if you have your AMS seals, that's something that we pull away. I do think that we end up in an interesting dynamic as, again, broadcast TV consolidates, where there's going to be this desire for even seasoned, sealed meteorologists. When you've got to pay the bills and that click's going to get more, there's going to be people that make that choice. And so we might hold over their heads, hey, we're going to pull your seal. At the end of the day, if they got to make that rent check, some of them are going to give up the seal for that. It's going to be a real interesting run. I think AI is already being leveraged by some folks. And I think as we get deeper into this, one of the things that I am hoping for, especially here in a conservative area in the South, is that there will be probably a pushback to a certain extent on AI-driven, AI-enhanced things. And so people are going to want real people that they know are giving them real information. And I think that's one of the things, I could be wrong about that. That's one of the things that known entities will be able to leverage going forward.
Yeah, at the end of the day, I think to me that what comes to mind is that, the fact that, humans have emotions. And when a tornado is headed towards your house, that's one of the most emotional moments a person could experience. And there's nothing that artificial intelligence is going to tell me to make me feel better at that point, right? I want a real human person that's taking all that into account. So yeah, it's going to be really interesting to see how all of this evolves. I want to switch gears a little bit and bring in some talk about our IBHS research, and there's going to be some ties into what happened in Mississippi with this as well. So I want to talk about interior water damage interior water damage to residential construction. It's still one of the most consistent, ever-present sources of insurance claims and losses. Obviously, at IBHS, a big part of our mission is to minimize those losses, keep people in their houses, and hopefully minimize that damage so that they don't have to deal with insured losses. The Insurance Information Institute, III, estimates from 2016 to 2020, about 1 in every 60 insured homes filed a claim resulting from interior water damage. We're seeing trends towards warmer, shorter winters across the U.S., but winter weather-driven interior water loss is still a consistent problem. We have more people, more houses, bigger houses in the path of a lot of these storms. Places like Huntsville, Alabama, and Nashville, and places where the population centers continue increasing. So let's talk about the extreme cold first. The leading culprit from the damage and interior water losses is from this extreme cold, from burst plumbing pipes. When we see these extreme Arctic outbreaks, especially in places in the Southeast, where the houses may not necessarily be designed to withstand this long duration extreme cold, we see a lot of these insured losses. Talk about some of the materials that the pipes are made out of, Ian. This has a little bit to do with this.
Yeah, so it's in a modern home, and this started really back in the late 80s through the 90s. We moved toward a lot of plastic flex pipe, whether it's PVC or some of the things you would commonly hear of referred to as PEX, which is pressure fittings. Those have different tolerances for how much pressure they can withstand. What is the design criteria? We know with a lot of plastics and composites, certain types, when they're left outside exposed to UV, become brittle with time. We also know water quality can affect things like those junctions and fittings. So some of it is we have materials in our homes that are set at a design limit. What often happens in these winter weather events, you have sort of your run of the mill losses. This is when I've got exposed pipes, maybe I have a crawl space foundation, and I just haven't insulated those pipes or those hose bibs outside. Those are extremely consistent losses. They happen all the time. And yes, for most of us who own a home, the most highly probable claim for us is going to be interior water, whatever that may be, whether it's winter weather or maybe just our hose fitting on the washer broke. That's going to be the most likely thing we ever have to deal with from an insurance perspective, especially in places that don't, away from the hurricane prone coast or right down the middle of hail land. That's the challenge we face. So we have a lot of materials that can be vulnerable. They do have a design limit, and they have to meet that design limit. In the South, you mentioned, Rachel, we do design buildings to remove heat, right? Like our summers can be very, very brutal. Everything is about ventilation. We also put plumbing on exterior walls. Move up into more colder climates, you won't see that. You won't see near as much plumbing on exterior walls, where those cavities between the outside building envelope and the inside can really cool off very, very fast. And that leaves us vulnerable when we do have these Arctic air outbreaks or winter weather system. But the key piece that it often shows up in all catastrophes is a cascade of damage or a compounding disaster. We have winter weather claims all the time, but it's when we have some trigger mechanism. And right in today's world, it is usually power outages. It is the failure in the 2021 event of the ERCOT grid in Texas, or in this case, we had a crippling ice storm that's going to take out power. That on top of the building vulnerabilities we already have and we know of, we know these are there. That's when we trip into a loss event that's going to be a lot more comparable to, say, a big severe weather outbreak or even a landfalling Cat 1 kind of Cat 2 hurricane. These events can kind of compound to that kind of scale. So that's what we're dealing with from a building stock perspective in the materials we have.
And talk about plumbing design temperatures. What does that mean? We use climatology to determine them. Talk about how they differ depending on what area of the country you're in and how we pinpoint those temperatures.
So we, in the American Society of Civil Engineers, that sets these design levels for different hazards. The International Plumbing Code is where it gets applied, as well as the International Residential Code, International Building Code. We set our plumbing design temperatures as a 2.5% probability of that temperature occurring. That's an outside temperature. It's not the interior space. So a 2.5% chance of whatever that value is. So take Atlanta, Georgia, for example. We'll use Atlanta. That plumbing design temp is 22 degrees Fahrenheit. So that's what our plumbing has to be able to meet, is the conditions outside that are 22F, assuming that our plumbing will be put under those conditions. So that's really what we designed for. And as our climate warms a bit, we have seen that those may relax a little bit. The occurrence of those really, really cold temperatures may not become as frequent. So there's a balancing act there. Another example, Houston, their temperature sits just below freezing, like their plumbing design temperature. And so there's the difference. Atlanta gets more cold air, Houston doesn't. But when we have one of these events that puts the infrastructure under pressure, we lose power. Now we can easily get over the span, as Matt mentioned, if you're dealing with 2 weeks and you have a big Arctic air mass, 2 weeks without power, it is not hard to get those temperatures in those exterior wall spaces down to that plumbing design temperature. And then failures start happening. As soon as that melts, if you can't shut your water off, you're going to end up with some of the pictures we see of water, even frozen water that's on walls. And then you've gone from something that was sort of a manageable claim into something that's probably just like interior water in a hurricane. You're out of your house for 6, 8, 9 months.
Right. And talk about sort of the habitability of houses. We need houses to to maintain those habitable conditions for 36 to 96 hours under those sub-freezing conditions in the absence of heating. Just talk about the impact of these long duration events.
Yeah, so we'll stay with Atlanta for a bit. Habitable conditions means once the temperature, it's 54 degrees Fahrenheit, and that's been set as once you go below that, it starts to become a threat. The health problems arise from sitting in those cold temperatures. So if you take a typical home in Atlanta, so this is built before the modern energy code. So think about anything almost the 2010s before. You can really point to about 2018 where we really started to put in some substantial. It really was about energy savings, but made our homes tighter and more well insulated. So you can get about 36 to 96 hours if your average temperature over the day is 27 degrees. This is in Atlanta before you get below 54 degrees. Now, those cavities on exterior walls are going to get colder. This is why we give you the guidance about opening up those cabinets to allow some of the warmer air into those external the exterior wall cavities, about trying to keep that temp out there just a little bit higher than it would. So you get 36 to 96 hours. The thing at that level, you're cooling that home at a rate of about 1 to 4 degrees per hour. So the clock's ticking. If you can't get heat back or produce heat inside that home, you will start to reach that design temperature in the space of, another 30 hours later, another 48 hours, and you're starting to bump up against those design temperatures. Now, flip that around with our modern code built homes, you can actually stretch out that habitability almost to a week now. They're very energy efficient, means they're well sealed. They just don't lose heat that fast. And so you can stretch that out over a longer period of time, which will help mitigate the loss and hopefully take it longer so that you can get power restored. But you think about most of our building stock in the United States is built prior to this. So this is a pretty big vulnerability. And again, the clock is ticking. You got a handful of days. You got 3, 4, 5 days before your house becomes physically uncomfortable to be in. It continues to cool. You may start to generate, once you get close to that freezing mark, now you're generating life safety concerns. And especially in those exterior wall cavities, you're going to be pushing those plumbing design limits just a handful of days later. So as Matt mentioned, when you're dealing with 2 weeks of power outages, you have a big Arctic air mass, you're in that really critical area where you're going to probably hit those plumbing design temps. And we saw that really in 2021. That Arctic air mass was really, really entrenched across the deep south. Fortunately, in this event, we managed to get back above freezing, at 3, 4, maybe in day 5. So we weren't pushing the extreme limits, but it didn't stop the damage from happening.
Yeah, I was living in Louisiana during the Texas ice storm. We had very similar impacts. I had an exterior wall pipe and a bathroom, and obviously I let it drip, but once the power went out, I lost power for about 2 days with that winter storm. Eventually it froze, and the power came back on, but I still had a ways to wait before I could turn the water back on and actually use that. So yeah, really interesting stuff. So that covers the cold air vulnerabilities. I want to talk more about the freezing rain, this ice impact. There's a really interesting presentation. Ian, you may have been there at the recent AGU conference. I know some of our colleagues were in New Orleans. There was a presentation by Zhong Lang Yang from University of Texas at Austin. It was titled "Freezing Rain in a Warming Climate, the Hidden Hazard of a Thawing Winter." So in this presentation, they talk about freezing rain ranking still among the most destructive, but least understood forms of winter precip. As global temperatures rise, we could be witnessing conditions that promote more frequent or intense freezing rain events as snowfall declines. They looked at the evolving geography of freezing rain across the continental U.S. from 96 to 2025, and the results indicated a decline in events across the Northeast, coupled with increasing frequency and duration in the southern Great Plains. Texas was called out specifically, some of those adjacent states to the east as well. And nationally, the number of high severity disaster level events has modestly declined, but medium severity events producing substantial losses have increased significantly across the Southeast in particular. They say that February has emerged as a peak month, replacing December through January. So understanding this freezing rain in a warming world, not just a meteorological challenge, sounds like a societal imperative to me. Warming does not, and this is one thing that's been difficult to message to the general public. A warming world does not necessarily bring fewer winter hazards. Sometimes it brings actually more dangerous ones. Talk about this, how this growing and aging infrastructure that we're talking about today. Talk about the risk this brings to that as we see more of these events potentially.
I mean, I think we hit it. We have to look at our power infrastructure as something that's critical, absolutely critical for societal recovery. One of my old professors at Texas Tech, Kishore Mehta, always said, that is the key to recovery, is getting the power back on, no matter what the event is. And I think this piece of work, while new, and I don't think it's made its way into the peer review literature yet, does start to make a little sense. Freezing rain, you're going to have shallow cold air masses with warm air overrunning it. We have warmer oceans. That's I mean, the Gulf of Mexico just sits sort of climatologically above average. It's almost a new base state. And that's going to help bring more moisture-laden air masses. We do know the potential for the bigger precip amounts exists. And so you just layer those conditions on top of each other. And that's probably sort of the pattern recognition that sort of comes out of this kind of work. Reverse it, like the mid-Atlantic has seen the largest decline in snowfall, across the entire country. But it will be interesting to see if we notice an uptick in freezing rain events. I have no idea how well we observe this hazard in storm data. I know the hail part of severe weather observations is not great. I don't know how we observe the freezing rain climatology to be able to hey, are we seeing these fingerprints? But it is something that's worrisome, because if you trigger a loss of infrastructure, in this case power, that winter storm becomes, its potential for catastrophe goes way, way up. Unless if you can keep it from hitting that tipping point, then you are dealing with something that from a loss perspective is not widespread. It's just common. It happens most winters, but that's the trigger that takes something from sort of the common source of loss to the potential disaster and catastrophe.
And Matt, you brought up some points about Mississippi, the combination of the Arctic air and the ice, dripping the faucets was not so simple. You had extreme infrastructure loss. Talk more about some of your observations from this particular event.
As you mentioned, the power loss, a huge compounding factor. And one of the crazy things for me to wrap my brain around, I went through the 2011 super outbreak of tornadoes. We lost more people in this ice storm than we did with that in my particular part of Mississippi, because of the loss of power and then the impacts on interior temperatures this is number 50 in so many ways here in Mississippi, poorly insulated and just older homes. And so, a lot of those interior issues you talked about as well, unfortunately, a loss of life. But so then that power has a ripple effect on rural water associations and their ability to deliver water to their customers. And so we ended up in a situation where the water providers did not have adequate or modern generators to be able to continue to get water to the end destination. And so as temperatures then dropped into the teens outside and single digits, you then had not just pipe breaks in people's homes, but in the infrastructure as well, as the water mains in some cases ended up freezing. So it was just this kind of escalating series of issues where we used our platform and the Public Service Commission, which is kind of in charge of all the public utilities here in the state of Mississippi, how they worked to, we worked together to try to get generators to these power cooperatives so that they had the ability to, or water associations, so they had the ability to push water to the end users. And then as they start adding pressure to lines, water lines break. It's these escalating series of issues that abnormal cold and extended loss of power loss caused.
Yeah, you bring up an interesting point. I want to point out the rural aspect. I mentioned I used to work in central Louisiana, just here west, and we lost power for 2 days with the 2021 winter storm, Hurricane Laura as well. I was without power and water for 7 days, and I lived over 100 miles away from the coast. And one of the reasons being the water system was located in a very rural area. It was actually amongst the trees of Kisatchie National Forest. So they could not physically get to the water system. They didn't have adequate generators to back it up. There were trees down that quite literally physically blocked their ability to restore the water. Talk about how much harder it is for these rural areas. It's a whole other factor of challenges to deal with in some of these situations.
It really is, one of the things that talking to these power cooperatives and water associations, it's that last mile where, if you've ever driven, or seen pictures of the back roads, like here in Mississippi, every back road has houses on it. And what makes it beautiful is these beautiful tree covered roads. And so people, might be half a mile away from their neighbors through just nothing but trees. And when you get into a significant ice storm like this, it prevented people from even getting, and even with chainsaws and the way people came together, getting to folks for quite a while. And so that then extended the time period to get the infrastructure back on. And so we ended up in a situation where, the ice stopped falling, I think, midday Sunday, but we still had trees falling because of the ice on Tuesday and Wednesday. So they would get some power lines back up and trees would fall and take them down again. And so we did end up with a lag in response here in Mississippi. National Guard wasn't called up until officially until Monday morning. I think that certainly helped extend the duration of some of the pain that we had. But with temperatures that briefly got above freezing midweek and then plunged back down in the single digits by the weekend, we had a solid week of below freezing, and we're just not made for that here.
Exactly. Really interesting points there. And I want to talk about briefly ice dams. This is a question we get a lot about at IBHS. Obviously, we do extensive research on the roof being your home's first line of defense that we say at IBHS. That's another source of interior water losses. Ian, talk more about ice dams. And I know this is of interest to some of our members as well. What do people need to know about ice dams?
Yeah, ice dams is something that sort of plagues the true cold climates, especially in older construction where you have snow and ice cover that can build up on your roof, and you go through multiple sort of freeze-thaw cycles where ice can actually block the ability of water to run off your roof cover. Thus, if you don't have a sealed roof deck, that water can actually come back under your roof cover, whether it's asphalt shingles like most of us, and come through those seams in the roof deck. That is a common issue, especially in older construction, that ventilation in attics is not well handled. If you think about really snowy climates, like I'll think about the Sierra Nevada, often there's actually heater systems that are employed along the edges of roofs to help remedy this, to make sure those areas can stay really clear of snow and ice. I noticed on my house here in Maryland that's a new build under the 2018 IRC. The ventilation through that space, the soffit vents, helped keep that area pretty clear of snow, even though we had a good 6 to 9 inches of snow on the roof at one point. And so I'm keeping an eye on this, knowing what some of the problems were. But the ventilation in modern code-built homes, this really is not as big a problem as it was 30, 40, 50 years ago, especially in an older home that maybe you've retrofitted the attic as living space. Those are things to keep a close eye on. So if you get snow and ice that build up on a roof, keep an eye on those edges where ice builds up and can actually keep that water that's now melted from running down into your gutters and away from your home. We talk about this with heavy rain and ice. It is so important to get water away from your home. keeping those gutters clear, things like that, so you don't have problems like this. Because if you don't have a sealed roof deck, water coming in your home, we talked about whatever it is, whether it's a burst pipe, wind-driven rain, does not matter. The dollars and disruption go up exponentially when that happens. It's one thing to have to replace your roof. It's another thing to have to replace your roof and all your drywall, or drywall in a third of your home. So those are some of the things to look out in winter weather. We hit the pipes. If you're a pier and beam, you got a crawl space, man, make sure those pipes are well insulated and covered. I did that this year. If you have a sprinkler system, especially when you have a cold winter, make sure those pipes are cleaned out. Take an air compressor and you can pressurize those systems and get all that water out of there. I had to do that this year. There is all these maintenance steps, and I'll tell you, winter weather and interior water is a lot about maintenance and keeping an eye on things. But again, we have these cascades that happens when the power goes out. There's only a handful of things you can do to try to buy some time. That's all you're doing is buying time. And then sometimes time runs out. You reach that design limit and you get a failure. Story about that, when we first built the IBHS Research Center, we hadn't completed insulating all the copper water lines in the big test chambers. So the big wind tunnel facility, we had an Arctic air event, pipe burst. We had water frozen all over the chamber floor. You could have ice skated on it. We just hadn't completed all those preps before we had a big cold event, and didn't shut the entire water system off. That actually drives the wind-driven rain system in that facility. It drives our fire suppression system. And so, yeah, literally about a couple of months into the opening of the IBHS Research Center, we dealt with this exact problem. And it did. It popped a big hole in one of the copper water lines up into the rain system, and we ended up with an ice rink out there.
Wow. I think
one of the things you mentioned that I thought was interesting, we had a power loss here at the house for only about 24 hours. And thinking back to what you mentioned a minute ago, talking about the time frame on how quickly things drop. We have a new build here about 2020. We did spray foam insulation in the walls here. Like we took a lot of this, we sealed the entire envelope of the home. So we did a lot of things to try to prep for an eventual ice storm here. And we still saw a significant and uncomfortable decline in that really 24-hour period there, that it just really put into context that these less well-insulated homes, multiple stories of people, I can see my breath, in the 30s in these homes. I'm interested to see how many insurance claims we're going to have. I think the number is going to be very high.
Yeah, and that on the claim side, it's going to take a while before these all get aggregated. I mean, this will be $1 billion loss event. I think that's what's going to happen. The question is, do we get to something that's the tens of billions? I don't think we won't know for quite a while. But yeah, the concern in the South is really older construction that will cool even faster. Matt, if you're sensibly able to notice that decline, you just double or triple that rate of temperature or heat loss in an older. I really worry. For me, I worry about that from the 1960s through the 80s. It's one of the most vulnerable eras of construction in the United States from an all hazard perspective, and this is no different. And so, if you're noticing that in your modern house, and I remember when you guys built that house, you're going to double or triple that in a older home. I watch it in we haven't had, thankfully, a sustained power outage, but I can watch here with our electric heat pump, even in the mid-Atlantic, maintain that temperature really, really well. But I remember when we moved in, our builder showed us how to turn on the gas fireplace in the event, which actually produces a fair bit of heat without power. He walked us through all the steps. And he's like, hey, we get ice storms here. We have a lot of tree-lined streets, even at a pretty urbanized area of the DMV, as folks say. He walked us through how to do that and to be able to ignite the gas fireplace without power, knowing that it produces enough heat. But this is why all those little tips we talk about, it's about buying time as best you can. And I think this is sort of one of those hidden things that sneaks up on people.
One other thing, so we had the same kind of situation. We have a gas fireplace, and I'm in the middle of, coverage because the ice storm's ongoing, but we've lost power. And so I had to get my wife on the internet. She had to figure out how to get that fireplace lit. But that brings up another compounding factor of this. I think we have gotten myself included as the person that prepares people, so lazy on preparation because we know the worst case scenario and just go look it up. The power loss also causes more issues than to loss of data and internet infrastructure as well, that then if we are not prepared, further enhances some issues we could run into.
Oh yeah, I mean, even just the simple act of knowing where your water shut-off valve is. We had several of our member companies come talk to us after the 2021 event about people just did not know where that shutoff was. On our home in South Carolina, it was actually out by the street. Our home here in Maryland, it's a nice ball valve in the basement, which is wonderful. I can just walk down, crank the ball valve, and we're in good shape. But in South Carolina, I remember having to go find it, and it needed the special chuck key to turn the water off. And most people, we don't think about this stuff anymore. And so we talk about preps for all perils, but this winter weather one might actually be where you get the most out of all these preps, because it's just about these little things of buying time, because unless you got a generator, you're not going to be able, you yourself cannot control when that power comes back on. You can help keep your streets clear as best you can, help out your neighbors with chainsaws, things like that. But that's it. That's all you got, is a lot of these tips to work off of and buy time.
One of the interesting things on the backside of this that we ran into was, as power restoration occurred, we ended up having fires and water loss at that point, as well as they're restoring power, and maybe you were cooking something in the stove, your house got too cold, and you decided to abandon and go to someplace else, which was a very common occurrence. Power comes back on, stove is on, fire starts. So many different layers that you have to turn everything off before you leave. You need to have the water shut off before you leave, because even though, yes, we want that power restoration, there's a whole series of other threats that come into play at that point.
Yeah, that's in our, as we talk to folks about tips, if you're even leaving your home for an extended vacation, it's not a bad idea to shut the water off. You never know, something dumb happens, a fitting on a washer, dryer, dishwasher breaks. Happens all the time. It's not a bad idea to shut it off, and it gives you practice when you need to of how to shut that water off. But yeah, Pete, this is a series of little things you just have to pay attention to, and knowing, it's just like in hurricanes when you're just so uncomfortable, more from the heat, from the power outage, you leave. And you don't forget what you left on, because at some point that power is coming back on. And obviously that's a real issue. There's been issues too of people using stoves to heat homes. That problem, space heaters, is constantly an issue. Misuse of generators. These kind of events that drag out, it is all about all this series of what we would consider small tips. These are not big renovations you're doing to your house, play a really big role. And it may be in the winter weather space, they play the biggest role. Whereas a hurricane or tornado, it's much more about some of the bigger things. What can I do to my roof? What can I do to my garage door? Things like that. But here, the little things really, really do matter. And it to be honest, it can make the difference between being out of your home or, hey, there's a pipe burst, I turn the water back on, I noticed the leak really, really quickly, I shut the water off. You just saved yourself a lot of money and about 8 months out of your home simply by just that action. So a lot of things you could do. And I think all of us, we just keep spreading the word on all the tips. And I get these events are hard. They're hard and drawn out, and they're stressful.
Yeah, compounding disaster, the tips and the maintenance, that has a compounding factor as well when you talk about all of those little things adding up. All right, well, really cool discussion. This has been super interesting. I think we covered a lot of great stuff today. So, of course, Dr. Ian Giammanco, thanks for joining us again. Matt Laubhan with Mississippi Live Weather, thanks for joining us on Disaster Discussions today. It was great to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, this has been On the Radar when winter hits the South: science communication, infrastructure stress tests, and interior water losses.
Thanks for listening to the Disaster Discussions podcast. Join us next month for a new episode. For more on IBHS's ongoing research efforts, visit IBHS.org.